Okay, good evening and welcome to the slightly revamped version of the Building the Scottish State. Our technical experts have been working diligently to improve the format and the presentation, and I've just seen this introduction for the first time, so I'm very pleased with the progress, so thank you, Paul. And so I have the great pleasure to have with me again MP Neale Hanvey. And tonight we want to talk about the possible Plan Bs that might be available and what the options on that are. And then we'd like to talk about what the deficiencies in the Westminster system are and how they could conceivably be addressed in a written constitution. So first of all, Neale, thanks for being with us again.
Hi, thanks. Nice to see you, Mark.
Okay, so I'd like to begin with, I'm working with a group called the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, and we've been thinking in our group about, different Plan Bs. And one idea that we came up with would be that because the Scottish Parliament has a pro-independence majority, there's no reason that they couldn't simply pass a resolution establishing that the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish people are sovereign, and that the Scottish Parliament represents that sovereignty and is the sole representative body that represents Scotland, and then just start to seek international recognition, try to, join EFTA, contact them, see what, and just really start going out into the world and doing it, because, in the contact we've had with different institutions like EFTA and Iceland and Norway, they're very open to recognizing Scotland, but Scotland has to take those first steps. So, I mean, first of all, how do you see that type of plan, and then what are some maybe things you can do from the Westminster perspective?
Well, I think this is a place that we've been at for quite a long time. I think that we've been aware that there has been significant resistance to a further independence referendum from the Westminster government or governments and prime ministers. And what I think Chris McElhenny and Angus MacNeil were keen to do was to begin to have the conversation that we now find ourselves having some time ago, so that we could, consider all of the various different options. Because I think what we need to do is to establish to the international community is that Scotland has made every effort to follow the route of an independence referendum, replicating the vote that happened in 2014. Angus's latest request for a Section 30 order has been refused, and so I think we can confidently demonstrate to the international community that we have tried to do our very best to work cooperatively with Westminster to begin our discussions of withdrawal from the United Kingdom. Now, I think the options of where we progress to there, some of them are untested. I think, the Martin Keating's question and the right to hold a consultative referendum independently is one option. There is the precedent that's been set in Westminster by Margaret Thatcher, Norman Tebbit, and various other commentators, where they have accepted that all that would be required to trigger negotiations for withdrawal from the United Kingdom would be for Scotland to send a majority of independent supporting MPs to Westminster. Now, that's been done 3 times, and I'm in the third lot of MPs, and regardless of which party I belong to and whether I'm an independent MP, none of those things matter. My voice is very firmly in favour of independence, and so that's another mechanism. And for both of those elements, I think there's something that your research group have looked at, which is how does that conversation begin to take place with the international community, and in what way would that process be legitimized and considered to be legal in the eyes of the international community? And I think that's very clearly set out in the UN statute recognise the right to self-determination. So my personal view is the ducks are all there, and we've known that the ducks have been there for quite some time. What we need to do now is to look at all of the strands that are related to that and begin to form a view about which option is the most of most value, and what actions need to be taken by people like myself and Kenny and members of the SNP, and indeed any others from civic society who want to reach out to the international community, whether that's politically or through their academic links or through their legal links, to begin to have that conversation, because it's not just a case of Scotland asking the UK government to let us go. It really is about building confidence abroad and building confidence at home. And so there's a need to begin a soft campaign, certainly now, but there's a need to start campaigning. And that's been something that has certainly been a great frustration to me over the last few years, that the majority of the Scottish government's efforts were campaigning to overturn a vote on Brexit that was supported by the majority of people in England. And I don't think that that's something we should do. Now, we can go back to the triple lock question around the Brexit vote and whether Scotland's been dragged out against its will, or none of that really matters. I think let's just dispense with those arguments. That it's important historically in the arguments we build when we discuss this with our friends in the international community. But I think fundamentally there's a real appetite in Europe and internationally for Scotland to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, to join the world as an independent country. That's absolutely my ambition. I don't think we have anything to fear, but what we cannot do is allow Boris Johnson and his Conservative government to dictate how we make our way in the world. We have to divorce ourselves from that reality.
Yeah, I completely agree, because in the research that we've done, as we've looked into international law, international law is extremely agnostic about how independence is achieved, and as long as it's as long as it's peaceful and democratic, and it can be accepted. And what recognition boils down to for a lot of people is whether or not they want to irritate England, basically, or the UK government. But given that the UK government's reputation is such an all-time low on the international scale, I don't see why there wouldn't be a lot of countries that would be extremely sympathetic, to say the least. And also, I spoke to a good friend of mine who works for the consulate, the U.S. consulate here in Rennes, and I asked him about it, just kind of under the radar, and he said it just needs to be kind of a democratic event, and the whole thing of being, in my view, the SNP government in Holyrood has been kind of caged in this whole Section 30 thing, and which is not going to be granted. But they don't have to. There's no other country in the world has achieved independence through a Section 30. There's a lot of other ways of skinning a cat, so to speak. And so, in my view, we need to broaden the discussion, and I hope that our discussion tonight can be part of that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think the fundamental point that no other country that has left the British Empire or seceded from UK control has meekly asked for a Section 30 order. They have sometimes quite violently made their point, and I definitely would be opposed to anything of that nature. But there is a need to have, as you say, a democratic event. And there were some conversations around that during the Scottish parliamentary election, whether it should be a plebiscite election. There were our views in the Alba Party about holding taking seats on the list away from unionist MSPs. so that we had the supermajority and could begin negotiations. I mean, there are various different ways to skin the cat, but we're a few years away from the next Westminster general election. That is the next democratic opportunity for a vote, if you like, and that could be a plebiscite election. I would hope that we would be able to do that as an independence movement rather than as independent parties. I think there was some disappointment after 2014 that there wasn't a more collegiate approach and a much broader and accepting church as existed during that campaign in the way that the 2015 general election was fought. So, my ambition for being elected as an MP was absolutely to secure independence. I do not want to be in London a moment longer than necessary, but I think I bring skills and abilities to the table to help us move that cause forward. So I think there are opportunities there. I certainly, along with Kenny and anyone else who's willing to help, and certainly whilst there may be some difficulties with certain members in the SNP group, there are still some pretty strong bonds and friendships there that Kenny and I still enjoy and still continue to have conversations about how we secure our constitutional future and the mandate to get us there. So I think there's quite a bit of research to be done around this. There's lots of options, whether it's looking at the Act of Union, whether and the treaty, or whether it is examining the UN Charter for self-determination. I mean, all of these are completely viable options. It's how do we, much the same as the question that you're trying to answer in your research work, is how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be as a nation? And so the Plan P conversation is really important, because that is part of charting that course of discovery to give us a secure route through the current situation, arriving at a mechanism at which to begin those negotiations, and then the negotiations themselves and the establishment of an independent state.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we were speaking before about a possible Westminster route, and you mentioned, possibly having the next Westminster election as a plebiscite. But I think there's a greater urgency than waiting that long. So, I mean, I know that you can't speak definitively, but I mean, what do you see as possible scenarios in a much shorter term? In terms of getting, achieving independence through negotiation within the Westminster system? How do you, I mean, again, I know you can't speak definitively, but what are some possible scenarios in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think all of the constitutional legal options need to be considered in a bit more detail. And they're, as I've said many times before, one of my great frustrations that led me to join the Alba Party, but not the only one, was that I didn't feel that we were having thorough enough conversations within the SNP group about these very matters. And
not to name names, but did you feel a reticence among certain members to just that they didn't want to talk about it, or that they were kind of comfy where they were, so they didn't want to become independent, or again, without being personal?
Absolutely. I do not believe that a single member of the SNP group does not want to see Scottish independence. Let's get that absolutely clear. I don't believe that for a second. However, there is varying senses of urgency, and I'm probably at the head of the queue on urgency, along with Kenny, obviously, but also various other people within the SNP group. And it's not that there's not an appetite to move things forward. There just isn't the work being done. And what we can't do is just pin all our hopes on a Section 30 order and winning a referendum. Those are not simple asks. And as we've discovered, Section 30 looks like it's just it's not going to happen. So let's just park that and say we've tried our best. it's not going to happen. We need to look at other options. And so those other options, they need to be explored in more detail. One of the great things about being an MP is we have access to the specialist clerks and library staff in the House of Commons, who I know people will probably feel they're the wrong people to ask these questions, but actually the majority, to a man, of the civil servants and clerks and library staff are incredibly capable people, and they are incredibly sensitive to their need to be impartial. And so there is some very real and constructive work that can be done there. It's not all going to fall on anyone in particular shoulders, but I think that piece of work needs to happen so that there's an opportunity to look at the best game, the best way to get there. Now, if we're able to do that and move the conversation forward swiftly, then that's certainly something that I would be keen to do. If we feel we've got a strong argument, if we feel we've got a clear mechanism, and we feel that there is the opportunity to get, most crucially, the support of the majority of independent supporting MPs to support any motion or debate or however, whatever tactic is felt to be most useful. Having that in place, I don't see any reason, given all that we've said, I don't see any reason why we can't move that forward before the next general election. And I guess there's two ways to look at it. Do you begin that work and make those arguments and bring forward your position to Parliament before a plebiscite, or do you consult and have the plebiscite before you do that piece of work? And I think it's probably a mix of both. In some ways, the plebiscite will confirm, serves an opportunity to confirm the negotiations that you've begun. But waiting until it's done is, I think, that doesn't come without its challenges, because then you're effectively parking the constitutional question until that time, and I don't think that's good enough. I think the appetite, certainly amongst our campaigners, is that we need to move things forward swiftly.
Okay, and conceivably, I mean, I don't know whether there's any precedent to this, but imagine you were to go to the clerk's office and say, "Look, okay, we've looked carefully at the Treaty of Union of 1707. Here are some clear violations of the Treaty of Union, including the Internal Market Bill, where because the Treaty of Union says that the English law cannot be imposed on Scotland. Clearly, in the case of the clearly in the case of the Internal Market Bill, that's a violation of the Treaty of Union. Can Scotland break the Treaty of Union, or can you vote as a Scottish group to vote that the Treaty of Union has been broken or something like that? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, but yeah. I mean, you see any? Yeah,
I think the first comment I would make, I'm going to recite this from a learned colleague, which is that I'm not a constitutional law expert. So I need to get proper advice on this, because, the argument could be compelling to me, but whether it's going to stack up in a legal argument or not, or whether I've got a blind spot to a weakness in an argument, that's something that I think we need to do. And it's certainly something I think we need to fund. So that's the first thing. We need to do that research thoroughly, as urgently as possible. In terms of whether the UK is in breach of the articles, I think that I can't remember them off the top of my head word by word, but certainly there is a concluding article, the words of which fail me now, but it's effectively that by all of the other separations of law and education, etc., that were specified in the above articles, there's a final one, or one near the end, that effectively says that the rest of legislation will be managed from the conjoined Parliament in London, in something along the lines, in the best interests of the Scottish people. Now, that's quite a nebulous kind of catch-all. However, I don't think anyone could say that the impact of Brexit, that the Scottish people did not vote for, the impact of Brexit has in any way been in or served our best or proper interests. And so there are fundamental examples such as that, consequential legislation, as you've mentioned, by the UK Internal Markets Act, that we can make clear demonstrations, whether that's to the insult to fishing, farming. Shellfish is a really good example where, it's almost like the UK government didn't think about the reality of being a third country in regards to legislation they'd been part of forming. So there are very clear impediments that we can demonstrate, both on a personal level about our freedom to move and live, etc., all of those freedoms, on a sort of economic level of the industries that I've just mentioned. There are plenty of, I think, really substantial examples where we can demonstrate that the decisions that have been taken against Scotland's expressed wishes have not been or have not served our best or proper interests. And so I think there is certainly something to be explored there. I think the English legislation being applied to Scotland is also, as you've said, out with certainly the spirit, if not the letter of the Act of Union. I say that not because Scots law is not important and it needs to be preserved, but because we do have legislative areas that we share, like employment law, for example. So there are common areas of legislation. It's when that legislation creeps into well-established areas of Scots law, or it affects or undermines the structures of established Scots law. I think that's where the stronger arguments might lie. But again, I think this needs further detail. But in some respects, I'm glad that we're here, because we need to get to this point. We need to start having a proper grown-up conversation, and most importantly, start that conversation with voters again to say, listen, guys, this is a goer.
And also consulting international lawyers. I mean,
yes,
and UK constitutional scholars, and just trying to get the best advice from all over and bring it together to make a solid proposal that and have different proposals. I mean, it's not that. I mean, I just think that all the eggs seem to be in the Section 30 basket, and I just don't. As we both know, that's pretty much a dead end for the foreseeable future. So I think if there was a way of taking it out of the scope of the Scottish Parliament and putting it in, and at least even if there is action in Westminster, even if it's not effective, at least putting pressure on the Scottish government to actually move on it. It might even if it has that effect, that would be useful as well. Okay,
I think you're absolutely right. I would like to be in a position where we worked collegiately, collaboratively, towards our common shared purpose. But I have to accept the reality that there is some ill feeling there. I'm not going to let that distract me. I've got, I came down to London with a very clear purpose in mind, and I will continue to work towards that. But I think you made a really good point there, though, Mark, which I'd just like to underline, which is that the work that I'm talking about doing, the purpose of that is not to satisfy me, as that's a strong argument. I think the point you made about that relationship with the international community and their legal advisors and their politicians, that they are comfortable with the proposal. That is a really fundamental and important point, because if we do anything rash, or we try to do a Boris Johnson and bend international law, that is going to get us absolutely nowhere.
Exactly. Okay. Well, I'll be happy to work with you and anyone else with our group on this, and so we'll discuss that after. But and so let's see. And so what I asked you to consider in addition for this thing is for this episode, because I'm the name of the show is Building the Scottish State, and in most of the preceding interviews I've just kind of talked about general affairs, but I wanted to kind of really shift the focus more to what how Scotland could be better than it was, because since I've become involved back in 2011, it was always with the idea that the Scotland could be better and it could be run its affairs much better than it certainly currently is under the Westminster government, and that if Scotland became independent and fell into the same old routine of corruption and nepotism and all that Westminster has, that it would have been a complete waste. Why just have a mini Westminster and Holyrood? That would be a complete waste. So what do you see as the being an MP and having based on your exposure to Westminster, what do you see as the big kind of flaws in that could perhaps be remedied or mitigated by suitable clauses in a written constitution?
Okay, I think there are fundamental challenges for any democracy for it to be effective. And so when you raise the opportunity to talk about this, the first point that I thought about, and I've mentioned it already, is how do we get from where we are to where it is we want to be, and how do we chart that course? How do we make that journey? And how do we illustrate what exactly it is that we want to achieve? Now, the first thing to do there, just as any change management process would demand, is to have an assessment of what works well, what works less well, and where there are real problems. And I think in terms of both governments, I think that recent events have exposed significant challenges. I think one thing that certainly Kenny McCaskill has been pursuing as a former Justice Secretary, I think it would be wise to listen to somebody of Kenny's experience and ability. But there's a fundamental problem in the governance structure of the Scottish Parliament and the role of the Lord Advocate. Separation of powers and separation of powers. So that is we have the anomaly from devolution that exists there. And that needs to be fixed. It's really important to have a separation of powers and a proper separation of powers, because it's not possible for each to hold the other to account if there is a power dynamic of influence that exists between them in any impeachable way. So I think that's really important. And I think that now that the ball, I think it's a wonderful achievement of Kenny to move that conversation on. Recently, he's now secured the support of the Prime Minister to look at that.
I saw that.
Now the ball is squarely at the feet of the Scottish government there, and so they need to make a decision about whether they want to do the right thing and, as an accepted democratic principle, have proper separation of powers, or to continue this uncomfortable middle way. I think is not a good look. And it certainly doesn't bode well for the kind of pitfalls that you're speaking about. We don't want to end up creating just a mini Westminster, because that will serve nobody. And certainly my priorities are, how do we lift people out of poverty and have a more fair and prosperous country, which is totally doable. So that's a really important plank. And I would reflect back, Martin Docherty Hughes was speaking on a point of order, I think it was yesterday, talking about the political interference in the legal system in India, and how important it was in a liberal democracy to have that separation of powers. And I agree with him 100%. And I have great concern for the constituent which he was talking about. But we have to be seen to do the same thing. We can't lecture, as London does, lecture the world about how to do things properly and then break international law yourself. So we have to get those fundamental principles clear. We also need to look at how each person is recognised in statute as a person of a person that matters, that we will take care of each other, that we will guard against and have a proper social security system rather than this threadbare welfare, because we're only as prosperous as the poorest in our communities. You know, that goes back to Adam Smith, the Kirkcaldy, you know, that from his musings on prosperity. So we need to find a way to articulate the importance of that. We need to be able to consider whether we are a monarchical state, or if we are, you know, we have a president and we have all of those republic trappings of a republic. I personally am not a big fan of not the royal family as such, but the notion of inherited
status, being hereditary head of state.
I don't accept that as right or proper. And you know, and I think good examples of that, I think poor Prince Harry is understanding how challenging being born into that kind of privilege can be. You know, it's not it's no party. I think we also need to think about our second chamber, the revising chamber, and how that works. And you know, there are a range of different views. So Rob McAlpine's Commonweal have set out some interesting thoughts about a citizens chamber.
We've been working on that in our group as well. A Senate, but a citizen Senate rather than an aristocratic Senate as it is in the United States. Yeah.
And I think those are really important because it is a mechanism that doesn't indulge personal interest, or it should at least not indulge personal interest. And as you know, as an MP has been pursuing something of very grave concern during the pandemic about the purchase of intravenous flow tests into the billions of pounds for a test that is completely discredited and does not perform the function it's been paid for. It's a huge waste of money, but there are questions behind that. Who's creaming off the profit from this? You know, there's significant profits here. These are cheap tests bought in China and are being purchased for a purpose that the manufacturer themselves does not claim that they can achieve. And it's something I'm making some headway with at long last, but it's been something I've been pursuing for the last year. And I'm hoping now that Matt Hancock is out of the way and is potentially a patsy for the whole mess, that we'll begin to get some answers. But, you know, Is
Javid any better or?
Well, I mean, he's different. Whether he's going to be any better, he's making, you know, very warm and encouraging noises about how important the NHS is. But we know from his banking background and his time as Chancellor that, you know, he is very capable of being shrewd. I think it was, trying to remember which Labour MP raised it this week. I think it was Richard Bergen raised it, that you know, during the pandemic, Sajid Javid has been on speaking tours making hundreds of thousands of pounds on the back of a pandemic, and it's just extraordinary that is someone's priority when they're elected as an MP to serve constituents. I don't know where he gets the time. You know, Kenny and I get roundly attacked in the media for saying that we're going to concentrate on Scottish priorities, but we've got an ex-chancellor who's floating around the world making huge sums of money speaking, and I don't know how that squares with his responsibilities in the House. So yeah, I think there are, there's a whole range of scandals that have led up to today. There's the expenses scandals. There was the cash for access scandal. There are so many of them, but this government during this period of time have been imbued in such dreadful scandal and accusation, and the opacity of their responses to attempts to hold them to account have been pretty grim. I had one question that was in for 4 months. You're supposed to get a written parliamentary question response at the longest of 6 weeks. It had been in for 4 months, and the response I got was, prorogation has happened before we've been able to answer this question, so we're not going to answer it. And the answers that I have been getting have been so dreadful. They've just been to explain policy to me, which I already know, but absolutely no substance to in response to the question. So we need to find mechanisms in which to address that. Our pressing need at the moment really is, how do we build a resilient recovery? Because we absolutely do not have the powers to get ourselves out of this mess without going cap in hand to Westminster. And as we've seen,
and that the priorities of Westminster will be London, the Southeast. I mean, the rest of England and Wales and Scotland are just basically afterthoughts. So yeah,
sure. And their priority, and we've seen it during the pandemic, their approach to Scotland getting its fair share of funding is to badge it and somehow, well, we've benevolently given you back some of your money. You should be grateful. How dare you question this? And it really, it's Stockholm syndrome. Some people accept that nonsense. It's our money. They're giving us a fraction of our own money back. This is not, the Westminster Benevolent Fund who are giving us a charitable donation to get us poor jocks out of the mess. So, we need to change that belief. And that's a very difficult thing to do in the mind of the public, because, bar broadcasters such as yourselves, that cringe mentality is reinforced regularly across the broadcast media in the UK.
And that's another one I wanted to get onto is the role of the media. And when I look at, the quality of the tabloids and the BBC and all that, and, they're mostly owned by Rupert Murdoch and the Barclay brothers and, these, basically oligarchs. But and you wonder, when I look at the changes in the Johnson administration, is that all Rupert Murdoch deciding whether Matt Hancock's out, or I don't know, but it just seems to me.
I think there are people with a better grasp on that situation than me, who have made pretty robust arguments in that direction, and that I think there's something that has troubled me for many years before I was a politician, which is the monopoly on media that wealthy interests have, and how that can influence and direct policy. And I think that certainly would be something as an independent country, I would hope we were able to avoid and have strict rules about ownership of broadcast and printed media. Obviously, the internet is a slightly more difficult sphere to monitor and manage. But we're already going the wrong way here, where bloggers and new media are being challenged in a way that the print media, the ones with the large resource and the types of people we're talking about behind them, they're not being challenged. And I think that balance has to be corrected. I think it's really important that all of us have the opportunity to be able to speak passionately on issues that we feel are important. Obviously, freedom of speech has its limits, but it's a really important principle of any democracy, and I think an independent journalistic body holding policymakers to account is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because David Henry, who I work with, he has suggested basically simply adopting the European law rules of ownership to Scotland. I mean, the EU has some pretty good media rules about that. And I know that you probably had the Craig Murray case in the back of your mind when you were speaking about that. And I think his case, without going into the details of the substance of it, but his situation brings forth a lot of very troubling aspects, and certainly with what happened to Alex Salmon as well. Mm-hmm. And certainly and I was just wondering to get some of your ideas on what are some of the other things. First of all, that Craig Murray's blog is being subject to scrutiny that, none of the other media, certainly not the Daily Record, has been subject to. That's certainly one of the things. What are some of the and certainly the role of the prosecutor, the role of the Lord Advocate in being able to say go after this person or go after this person. What are just in terms of what the Craig Murray case highlights? What are some of the other things that his case highlights in terms of the deficiencies of governance and separation of powers, et cetera?
Yeah, it really is an exemplar case in that whether there's a perception of bias or it's real is kind of irrelevant. Once that perception exists, then there's a responsibility for that to be addressed sensitively. Now, we know that throughout the whole Salmond affair, there were questions raised about the actors within that whole drama and the relationships and linkages that exist there. Now, I'm not certainly not going to start naming any individuals, and it's not really for me. That's not really the issue. It's about how do you look at that situation and draw out fundamental principles of justice. Mm-hmm. So there are certain maxims that are accepted, and they are things like we are all equal before the law. I think there's a question around that, that equals are treated equally and unequals are treated unequally. That's I think Aristotelian maxim, but there are various other ethical, moral, and legal maxims that need to be examined as we sift through a case such as this. And I've given it quite a lot of thought and obviously had conversations with various people. But, there's an assumption, I think, that, Craig was, took the, attempted to identify the complainants deliberately. And, very fundamental principles. Well, you don't know the operation of the man's mind, so you can't make that decision unless you've got evidence to back that up. And so the only evidence that I am aware of that exists is the panel-based polls that were repeated. And Craig has not been identified on a single occasion in any of those polls as a source of jigsaw identification. And so whilst you may suspect that he did it deliberately, the evidence that does exist doesn't support that. Then there are...
And that certainly gets into broader questions about admissibility of evidence, what should be excluded, what should not be excluded. I think that's another thing that certainly comes up from that. And the idea that the misapplication, from what I understand, the poll that he had conducted in his defense also said that there were other much more mainstream that identified them much more clearly from a jigsaw point of view. But of course, they weren't pursued at all. So that would be another thing that would be.
So I mean, all of those points are important. But if we step back from the case and ask some fundamental questions about what is the reason for the continued anonymity. Why is that important? And what is that trying to conceal? Now, they're very straightforward and answers to that are completely justified, which is these are private individuals who found this a very traumatic experience, and it would be incredibly detrimental and harmful to them to have their identity revealed after going through such a painful process. I'm not going to argue with that at all. But when accusations exist that there are actors involved in this with linkages to senior members in government and in the legal system, then there needs to be a mechanism that allows that to be considered. And if that needs to be behind closed doors, then so be it. But it needs to be done in a way that is not, the pantomime that we had with the harassment inquiry at Westminster, which was clearly politicized because it was run by politicians. I'm not sure that was in any way helpful at all. I felt certainly as a member of the public watching the testimony, both, and I watched it intently from start to finish, both of Alec and from Nicola Sturgeon. And certainly my experience of listening to the evidence was very different to the headlines. But it's the headlines that the majority of people believe. And so I think there's a real fundamental question to be asked about: why are people being protected? Not that I'm suggesting that they should be exposed. What I'm saying is, why are they being protected? Do we understand that it's legitimate? Has that question been asked and explored in a way that that can be confirmed as being a balanced, neutral finding? The second point that I'd make about the situation is the rumor mill that exists around relationships between the Crown Prosecution and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal's Office and members of government. The obvious one is that the Lord Advocate sits on the cabinet, and that whether there's any jiggery pokery or anything underhand going on there, that gives a perception of apparent and potential bias. And so we have to have that conversation. It's not an accusation that, that James Wolfe has misbehaved. It's just a statement of fact that there's a close relationship that exists there. And is it proper that that is the person who is pursuing the action and making the decisions about who to prosecute for jigsaw identification and who not? Now, I know he's moved on and we've got a new Lord Advocate, so hopefully things will change. But that doesn't change Craig's position. That doesn't change where he finds himself. And so there are fundamental challenges there. There's also the responsibility for the First Minister to make senior legal appointments. And that raises very serious questions about how those appointments are made. And this is not, again, I'm not making any accusations that the First Minister has behaved improperly. What I'm saying is that if the process is not seen to be scrupulously clean and fair, then it leaves her open to the rumour mill in the background. And that is not really any way for us to conduct business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And what do you think in a written constitution these types of things could be mitigated or resolved? I'm not asking maybe specific clauses, but I mean, what do you, maybe having just, do you think that it's to the point where that a constitution should specify exactly what the role should be, or should there be more general principles, or how do you see it?
I think so. I'll take this away from politics for a moment. So, in healthcare, so my domain, where I'm comfortable with, you would come across an exceptional circumstance where everybody would be going, oh, this can't happen again. We'll have to write a policy for it. And I've been there myself. And what you quickly discover is that if you try to write a policy for every eventuality, you make practice in an uncertain discipline very, very difficult, because you micromanage the clinical judgment of the practitioners in the field. And so what you have to do is to come back from that and say, well, what are the principles that have been breached here? Where are the inherent risks and difficulties? And I think if you approach anything like that in such a way, then it becomes much more helpful to the law to then set the precedents that will be effectively the explainers of what that principle means in practice. Mm-hmm. So I think whilst it can't be woolly, I mean, it needs to be clear about what the principles are. The interpretation of them is a matter for the legal discipline. And so they need to be informative enough to be able to make a judgment, but not so specific that there's no latitude in there for circumstance or prevailing differences.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end, so I wanted to get a few of the questions and then just get up any wrap-up statements that you'd like to make. Stephen, why don't we withdraw our MPs, resources, and taxes from Westminster? I think it's a little easier said than done, but I think that what he brings up is, that we were speaking about earlier, is actually using, beginning to at least consider the options of using the Westminster route to independence rather than waiting indefinitely for Section 30. So,
I think I'll be very quick on that, Mark. But I think the appetite for that kind of action really rests with Ireland and the withdrawal of Irish MPs from the UK government back in the 1920s. It was effective at that time. I think if you then look at from the period after partition and the fact that Sinn Féin MPs don't formally sit in Parliament, I'm not in any way decrying their position, because I fully understand it and accept it. I think it's been less helpful. It certainly hasn't advanced their principal aim of Irish unification. Certainly not as much as the current combative relationship between the DUP and Boris Johnson. That seems to be much more helpful to the cause of Irish unification. So whilst it's a great showpiece, I think what we've got to do is go through the all of the points we made at the head of the show, Mark, about engaging with the international community, showing that we've done our very best, being able to demonstrate that we've utilised the positions that we hold down there for the best purposes for the Scottish people. And I think what I would criticise, including myself, the MPs from Scotland at the moment, is that we're far too tied up in the minutiae of Westminster's business, and we need to, and certainly something Kenny and I are very keen to do, is to shift our focus away from this bill and that bill, albeit there will be ones that are really important, and focus much more on how we move the constitutional debate forward.
Okay, and and I know I've interviewed Angus McNaught, and do you think that there's a good few SNP MPs that would be willing to be very helpful in that respect? Yeah, I do. It's a difficult balance. I'm not going to start naming names because, as people will appreciate, it's not a comfortable place to be particularly outspoken in the party at the moment, and I certainly don't want to exacerbate the challenges anybody has. But certainly, I'm continuing to have dialogue with people who I trust in the SNP to move the conversation forward, and I know that they are utterly determined to make that happen. So that's, in terms of reassurance, that
that spirit is definitely alive and well, and I'll continue to do my very best. But what I don't want to do is, get into a, us and them kind of scenario, because whilst it may exist with certain individuals, it certainly doesn't exist with my friendships from, I've still got a whole lot of friends who are members of the SNP. I've got certain people in the SNP who've chosen to effectively go in the huff for me, but I can't do anything about that. I'll just continue to do what I think is the right thing.
Okay. Well, I'm just sorry for some of the other questions, but I'd like to just wrap it up. And is there anything you'd like to kind of make a closing statement, if you will, before we say goodbye to our listeners?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks very much for having me, Mark, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. It's always a joy to chat about these matters that we feel so passionately about and care so much about, and I hope that what I've said tonight is encouraging for the movement. I may be an MP, I may be a member of the Alba Party, but at my heart and at my core, I'm a yeser, just like everybody else. That's why I'm here. I'm just trying to be as useful as I possibly can and to move us forward to independence. And I will work with anyone in that spirit to deliver our country's future. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm, always glad to explore these things, and certainly keen to continue to look at the work that you guys are doing in the research group.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone and thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.